Hey folks, Doug Blake with Body Design University. Welcome to another weekly study. And in this video, we're going to look at chapter 13, which is the conditions for clients with chronic disease. I'm taking this off of a comment that was made inside the Facebook group, asking the question of how important is it to know this information. And so just wanted to kind of help you out with this and give you some clues as to how you deal with chapter 13 and what you can do with it afterwards. And that's really the key to this chapter. And in order to help you with this, I'm gonna tell you to go to the study guide that we have. You can download that, print it, take a look at it. And I am going to go to chapter 13, considerations for clients with chronic disease. And it is literally two bullet points. And there's a reason for that. Basically, from a general overview perspective, chapter 13 is just a list of some issues, chronic diseases, and they got charts with them. So the FIT VP concept, frequency, intensity, time, things like that ACE uses, which is great. But the point is that there's really nothing more in the chapter that you're going to see anyway on the exam. And there is a comment, again, on the Facebook page from a student that already took the test. And by the way, this individual is not alone in saying this. It's not like you're just not going to see a lot of questions generally from chapter 13. Remember, what ACE does is they test according to domains. So there's a percentage from particular study areas or informational areas that are broken into the 4 domains. So all you got to really do is look at the chapters that are represented in each domain and the number of questions that are represented from there. And what you'll find is, in general, it's not the highest priority chapter, but of course, they can ask questions from any and all of the chapters in any one of the particular exams that they're running through at that time. But in chapter 13, the idea is to do first one really important thing. And by the way, when I say to memorize the chart, that's the ideal scenario. Most folks are simply not going to memorize an actual chart and everything in it. But that's okay, because what ACE has done for you, by the way, anytime they give you a table or chart, they're just trying to coalesce a ton of information into an easy to see, easy to view, and then easy to study format. I know I look at table 13.1 all the way through all these other tables throughout this entire chapter. And the idea of trying to memorize that plus all the other information is a daunting task, which is why the key to memorization in any case, and that's why I have my pad and pen, because that's what you should have when you study. Just keep in mind, when you're studying textbook material like this, read, write, recite, rewrite it, use colored markers, draw pictures, all of those things that we speak about to help your brain to memorize and understand this information. Normally, what I do is I will tell students, especially in this particular chapter, is simply look for, from all of these different conditions, just look for the similarities in on each row. Okay, and that's really the simplest way to do it. So I can memorize, pretty well, 10, 12, 15 different charts by looking for similarities. And so what I would do is I would take chapter 13. You notice I'm going through, let me get to the end of chapter 13. Chapter 13 is a fair amount of information. Ton of information in here that's actually usable when you get out there and start to train people. Please keep in mind, ACE has to be very, very careful how they navigate through information and material that gets, precariously close to clinical type of handling of the material. You're not a doctor, and unless you are, You're not a therapist unless you are. But if you're a personal fitness trainer, you got to be really, really careful. Remember, scope of practice. So they're giving you a lot of information, but they're not telling you that you have to proceed with how to actually cure these particular conditions. The goal here is to understand the chronic condition, because for the most part, a couple of them in here are very common, and you're going to see them, and that's why they put it in here. And they start off with cardiovascular disease. If you look at the chapter 13 study video that I did specifically for the textbook, you'll realize that when I go through it, I'm hitting upon these the basic elements themselves. In this video, I just wanted to give you kind of a broad overview how to deal with these particular tables. And this is how I do it. It's not magic, and it's really pretty straightforward. I look at the actual table, and I know that every one of these basic tables is listed as exercise guidelines summary. So that's the table you're looking for. 13.1, 13.1, table 13.4. So you have cardiovascular disease, hypertension. Those are the tables that are basically set up the same exact way. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to just write it down. So I'm going to put frequency, FITT, progression, and I'm going to break it up the same way they did. Now it takes just a little bit of time, but trust me, when you do it and go through it once, it makes it so much easier to collapse all that information into a sort of a more unified way of understanding it. Once I do that, I take each of those individual variables, right, the rows. So I look at frequency. Now let's just use frequency as an example of this. So in the cardiorespiratory training, frequency for cardiovascular disease. Now there's one for cardiovascular disease. There's one for hypertension. There's one for probably stroke, right? And you know all of these chronic diseases. And all I'm going to do is right at the top, cardiovascular or CR disease. And I'm going to write at the top all of those variables. You could, however you want to do it. I mean, that's up to you how you want to do this. Maybe do it a long way like that. I'm going to write frequency and just take a look at the frequency and realize that for the most part, this is going to be basically common for all of these. For the most part, the number of days per week that a doctor, physician would want a patient to train and do cardiovascular training is for the most part every day, for the most part. Now, there are some slight differences, like here with CV disease, cardiovascular disease, at least 3, but preferably 5 or what? 5 or more. So minimum 3, 5 or more. Don't look at the rest of the chart. Just go down and now go over to hypertension, most, but preferably all days of the week. Guidelines for stroke, 3 to 5 days per week. Starting to get the idea. PAD, 3 to 5 days per week. Look, for the most part, although you have all these charts, a lot of these guys are absolutely the same. Cardiovascular, 5 or more days per week. Dyslipidemia, right? High blood cholesterol. Diabetes. Gee, let me guess. Let me think. Every day, 3 to 7 days per week. And that's kind of 5 or more days per week. Okay, you get the idea. I don't want to spend too much time going over and being redundant about this. When you get to the different variables, intensity, yes, I know that there's 1, 2, 3 bullet points with all of this information. For the most part, hear what I'm saying? For the most part, ACE is not going to question you on the difference between cardiovascular disease and stroke from a intensity perspective is 40 to 60% heart rate reserve versus 55 to 60% heart rate reserve. That's just too in depth of a question that would, you're just not going to see something like that. You'll see more generalized questions, and you could ask anybody that's taken the exam, even if they do remember questions from this chapter. It's not going to be too many, but again, the goal is that if you are trying to memorize memorize the material in chapter 13, at least to know it for the test, that's how you would deal with this. My recommendation is that you get to know the conditions, because guess what? Once you pass the ACE exam, hopefully you're going to be out there training people. Okay. And when you're out there training people that have had, cardiovascular disease in some way, shape, or form, stroke, whatever it is, if they've got high blood pressure, they're on meds more than likely. If they have high cholesterol, they're probably on meds. So it really is helpful to know this. Now, remember, just keep in mind also that when you're dealing with the quote average client that has any of these conditions, you acquiesce to the physician. You don't start doing stuff just on your own. You make sure after you do your initial evaluation, things like that, you make sure you get what the doctor says. And when the doctor says, oh, they just need to exercise at a moderate, okay, but I need to know that. And I want that written down. I want that on paper so that the doctor actually said, here's what I want my patient, your client, to do. It's really important to keep that in mind from a scope of practice perspective. Look, chapter 13, that's really what you got. Now, there are other tables in here that are not the exercise guideline summary. And so those, for instance, you can look at and kind of get an idea, an appreciation for the material and how it can help you in the real world. But you're not going to see a whole lot of that on the exam. Now, one thing we are noticing students are telling us in particular is that they're seeing more questions that are coming from, in particular, the mover method boxes that are, if you got their textbook, it's in sort of this light olive green color, and it gives you a back and forth client, client trainer conversation. Not a bad idea to read them. Again, even if you do see a question, you're just not going to see a whole lot of them. And as you go through the chapter, expand your knowledge, you may see a question specifically from the expand your knowledge. But again, in each chapter, and particularly in chapter 13, there's only one box here that says expand your knowledge. Not a bad idea to maybe look at it, read through it, and just keep in mind, even though we say the goal is to pass the exam, there's also the reality that you're going to be training people afterwards. So ACE has to walk this fine line of, we got to give you the information, give it to you in such a way you can pass exam questions, but they're actually concerned about what you're going to do when you're actually training people. Okay. So that's why chapter 13 is actually a really important chapter. Get to know it, because you're going to be a personal trainer. And if you're going to be a personal trainer, you're not just doing dumbbell curls and squats. You're not. You are doing those things, and hopefully you're doing them correctly. That's the biomechanics stuff. But when you're dealing with average people with any of these chronic conditions, it's a good idea to kind of know what the industry standards are when it comes to doing cardiovascular training and muscular, and they have muscular training here. So just keep that in mind. Group them as close as you can together. This way, when you're done writing it down on your chart, you could technically, if you just wanted to think of one of the chronic conditions and say asthma or stroke, you should be able to roughly get an idea of what the Fit VP information would be for that, or get pretty close to it. But that's one of the ways from a studying perspective that I would say to handle this, which is when you have multiple charts and they're all basically the same information, but just different. And when I say the same, I'm talking about the way they're formatted, but you're dealing with multiple conditions. Like in this case, it's actually fairly easy. I can write it straight across, and then I can just write down each condition. And and what those fit VP variables are for it. And then the other thing, by the way, is to condense some of the wording down if you have to, right? Normally what I do is I read through and I try to get what the editor has been trying to say about it in the table. And then I just might, normally what I'll do is I'll cut it down in my own words so that I understand the table a little bit better. For instance, clients with cancer, I don't know, 3 to 5 days per week. Intensity is moderate. You're going to see that throughout most of the conditions. It's not a whole lot you can do to cut this down word wise, but the idea is that the cancer guidelines are for the most part almost exactly the same as for the other guidelines with some minor variations. So keep that in mind as you're going through it. Again, chapter 13, not the highest priority chapter in the textbook, but I would say important from a real world perspective when you're actually out there training people. I hope that this was helpful. Look, the goal always at BDU is to help you pass the ACE exam on the first attempt. If you have not, please subscribe on our YouTube channel. And of course, you can ring that bell so you get notifications. If you have any questions, of course, put them in the comment section. And as well, if you're on the Facebook page, you can also make sure you're posting questions, but please be precise with the question. Try to make it as specific as possible. Look, take pictures of the little quiz questions, test questions that you have. Be specific to the chapter, to the area that you want an explanation on, and we'll be more than happy to help you with that. Have a great weekend, and we'll see you next